This is Dennis Nielsen, also known as the Muswell murderer or kindly killer. This Scottish serial killer was known to have defiled, murdered, and dismembered 15 young boys and men between the years of 1978 and 1983 in London. Nielsen would often target homosexual homeless men or students who he encountered randomly at bars and invited them to his house. He would lure them there with offers of food and alcohol, and he would frequently want them for sex and companionship. Once they were exhausted or unable to defend themselves, he would strangle them to death. If he were unsuccessful, he would resort to drowning them in the sink or bathtub, even if it was post-mortem. He invited them over wanting company. Nielsen engaged in strange rituals after his murders, in which he bathed the bodies, cleaned the young men, and shaved them. He sometimes applied makeup on their faces and dressed them. He stated that he lived with them and talked to his dead victims. He would perform sexual acts on or to the bodies and sexually assault them. He would dissect their bodies and dismember them after enjoying their company for a while. His method of doing so would be to butcher them in his kitchen. His killing spree began at an address in Melrose Avenue, where he would bury the remains in the garden or burn them in a bonfire. He was forced to resort to other members after moving to the Muswell Hill district, such as flushing parts down the toilet, boiling and cooking other parts, and stuffing some in bags and placing them under the floorboards. The blockage of the sewer system caused a small explosion in his building. Since he had been flushing body parts down the toilet, Nielsen had the audacity to call the waste company Dino Rod and complain about the smell, either out of stupidity, being oblivious to risk, or confidence. The employee who answered the call found bones and flesh-like substances when he opened the drain cover. After a thorough inspection of the pipes was carried out the following day, police were called for further investigation. That night, neighbors saw Nielsen trying to cover up his tracks by cleaning out actual human remains from the pipe. The next day, it was reported that he told a co-worker that if he didn't come in, he'd either be dead or in jail. Upon further inspection of the pipe, the bones of a human hand were found. The foul odor coming from the bags of remains he kept beneath the floorboards was noticed by police in his apartment. He confessed calmly when asked about the smell. Nielsen was sentenced to life without eligibility for parole for at least 25 years. The alarming fact here is that Nielsen possibly could have gotten away with it if he hadn't disposed of his victims like he did while living in Melrose Avenue and burning them or burying them. If he hadn't flushed body parts down a toilet, if maybe he had thought to clean the pipes out before calling the waste company, and if he hadn't complained about the sewage system he himself destroyed. For a long time, he almost did get away with it. This is Arthur John Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer. This American serial killer was active in Rochester, New York from 1972 through to 1989. He was the first person to commit a known murder in his hometown of Watertown, New York, where he killed a young boy and girl. Although convicted early in his murderous career, he still racked up numerous victims, some of whom were children. Arthur was initially sentenced to 25 years behind bars for the killing of a 10-year-old, which should have curbed his killing spree. However, an error made by the Justice Department saw that he was no longer deemed a threat to anyone, and he was released early. He served only 14 years of his sentence. This mistake was fatal for the 12 women he would go on to kill. He was a food service worker who traveled the streets of Rochester in his girlfriend's car, looking for sex workers to kill. Police were shocked by the killings because they didn't have any leads, no procedure, and no evidence. The police were given too much credit, according to Robert Keppel, a retired detective, and this does seem to be the case, judging by how he was caught. Police arrived at a scene where the killer had dumped a body, believing that he would return sometime later. They were right, and they found their killer. Arthur was urinating at the scene of the crime. Shawcross was photographed of eating his lunch over the body of one of his victims using helicopter surveillance. In the end, he was convicted and spent the rest of his life in prison. Arthur may have thought that he would never be caught, only if he could have saved his lunch for later. Shawcross died on November 10, 2008, while serving a 250-year prison sentence for his crimes. He was 63 years old, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, and an authority on violent behavior. Michael H. Stone even went on to identify Shawcross as one of the most egregious examples of the unwarranted release of a prisoner in his book, The Anatomy of Evil. This is Dennis Rader, known as the BTK Killer for his preferred method of binding, torturing, and killing. Dennis Rader committed a series of murders, killing a total of 10 people in Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991. Rader stated that it was all for the thrill of the hunt. He wandered around the city until he found his target. Once he learned his victims' routines, Rader would stalk them. And once he was ready to attack, he would break into their homes, cut off their phone lines, and bind, torture, and kill them. To intimidate his victims, he carried a gun and usually tied them up and killed them either by strangulation or suffocation with plastic bags. For his personal collection, he would take articles from the murder scene. They sometimes included women's underwear. Rader admitted that he was getting sexual gratification from committing the killings. He began to exhibit homicidal tendencies at an early age by torturing, hanging, and killing small animals as a child, according to several reports. He was described as being polite, well-mannered, and kind by those who knew him. Even as an adult, Rader gave the impression to everyone around him of being a moral man with good values. He was a member of a Christ Lutheran church and held the presidency of the church council. He was considered to be a pillar of the community. Little did the community know that Rader was an individual who fantasized about torturing and killing women. His fantasy would become a reality on January 15, 1974, when he cut the phone line and broke into the home of the Otero family. 4 of the 7 family members were awake when Rader came in and told them that he was a fugitive who needed money and a car before asking them to lie down. The family complied with his orders and allowed themselves to be tied up by Rader, believing he would only take what he required and leave. He killed the father, Joseph Otero, 38 years old, first by suffocating him with a plastic bag. Mother Julie Otero, 34 years old, was next. When Rader struggled to end her life with his bare hands, he strangled her with a rope. The body of 9-year-old Joseph Jr. was found face down with a plastic bag over his head. 11-year-old Josephine was found hanging from a drainage pipe in the basement. On what should have been a typical afternoon after school, siblings Charlie Otero, Daniel, 14, and Carmen, 13, arrived home and found the bodies of their family members. A few months later, in April 1974, Rader broke into and hid inside the home of 21-year-old Catherine Bright. Rader was surprised to discover that she was accompanied by her 19-year-old brother, Kevin Bright. He tied both of them up and strangled Catherine, but he killed her by stabbing her 11 times in the back and torso. Rader shot Kevin twice, but he survived. Rader then ran away from the crime scene. During October of that same year, one of the BTK killer began his notorious cat and mouse game with the police and the press. He began seeking notoriety by placing a letter inside a book of the Wichita Public Library. He gave a detailed description of the Otero murders and confessed to them. He even called the Wichita Eagle to let them know about this letter. The code word for his name that he revealed in the letter would be blind them, torture them, kill them, BTK, which he would be known for the rest of his life. Rader's bloodlust would remain until 1977, when he strangled Shirley Vane Relford, who was 24 years old, with a rope. His children were present inside the home, and he barricaded them in a bathroom. He then fled the scene. 9 months later, he struck again when he strangled 25-year-old Nancy Fox to death with a belt. He would not strike again until April 1985, when he strangled Maureen Hedge, 53, using his bare hands, and again in September 1986, when he used nylon stockings to strangle 28-year-old Vicky Weshery. In 1991, Rader would kill his last victim when he strangled 62-year-old Dolores Davis with her pantyhose. Rader's greed for fame is what got him caught. Over the years, he wrote letters and called the police department and the media to taunt them. The descriptions of the murders, photographs of the murders, driver's licenses of the victims, and even items from the crime scenes were often included. Rader began a series of communication with local media in 2004, probably because of the lack of attention he had been getting since the case of the BTK. This is what would eventually lead to his arrest, though it had been years since he fed his homicidal lust. Rader could have gotten away with the murder had he not trusted the police's answer when they said they saw a floppy disk couldn't be traced to him when he asked if it would be safe to throw away. Thanks to the dates on the disk, authorities were led to his church, and shortly after, to him. Rader is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas for his crimes.